One of the criticisms the comic industry has had lately is that they're focusing too much on coming of age stories or quiet moments with characters, and they're not doing enough with the action. But if you look back at some of the most popular books, some of the ones that really stand out in the minds of collectors, they're often those quiet moment books, or the introspective ones, or the ones where we see a new side to a villain, or something that is a little bit more nuanced. Those are the ones that get reviewed highly, not just by the Eisner Awards, but by fans as well. And yet, those same fans tend to go off on those titles, saying they don't want them. What happened to the good old-fashioned, supervillain fight? Do fans just want two contradictory things at once? Well, not really. There's a reason for this, and I'm going to go into it. Hey, everybody, this is Perch, and this is an interesting contradiction, and I think there's a pretty obvious answer to it if you really get down to it. But the comment comes up a lot that people will say, we missed the big action of the '90s. We want kind of these comic books that have the Masters of Evil going after the Avengers. It's a great storyline, by the way, back in the day where Jarvis had to kind of defend himself. Anyway, that was kind of tucked away, as I recall, close to Inferno as well, if memory serves. Every time I hear that phrase, by the way, I always think of Iron Chef Japan. But anyway, that's a different story. Um, too many things all at once. That's my style, right? I just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. But people will say they want these kind of action books, but when they talk about some of their favorite comic stories, it's things like kind of Craven's Last Hunt, or comics that had some action, but a lot more was kind of this in-depth, almost psychological tale of characters. Even Punisher: Return to Big Nothing, which is a very well-crafted book. If you've never heard of that, from the '80s, a really, really good story, great stuff, good, just all around great. But a lot of these comics, you open them up and you're like, well, what do you know? There's lots of dialogue here. There's lots of talky bits. There's lots of kind of nuance being shown with the heroes and the villains. And it's not like it's just 22 pages of Spider-Man or the Punisher or Batman just blowing people away and doing big action. In fact, if you look at something like Frank Miller's All-Star Batman, which just gets wrecked in reviews, that comic is pretty much wall-to-wall action. It's there's plenty of action in that book, but it's not. Very few people would call that a good comic. I mean, there are some. I mean, and every comic kind of has a different place of love in everybody's hearts. There's parts of All Star Batman that I think is pretty great in just how kind of bananas this whole comic is. I mean, this included Batman and Robin painting themselves yellow. I mean, there's aspects that would fit really well into kind of those crazy '70s comics where things were zany and didn't make a whole lot of sense. But you've got Frank Miller and Jim Lee doing this story with big close-ups on Vicky Vale's butt and everything else. But anyway, those are the kind of comics that people say they often pine for. But when you get to specifics, they want they have fond memories of the Chris Claremont baseball scenes with the X-Men, or some of the kind of the more thoughtful stories with Batman. I mean, even the original Dark Knight series by Frank Miller had some really great action sequences, but it also had plenty of kind of quieter moments where the hero is really thinking about what's going on, and that makes it kind of a classic story. And I think that there's an obvious reason for that, and it's called balance. If you have both, if you have action sequences, it tends to make the quieter moments mean more, because you're letting characters take a breath, and you're diving into maybe some detail, and then they're going back into action, back into big adventure. And Chris Claremont was great with that, with Uncanny X-Men, where you'd have huge stories. I mean, you'd have the Dark Phoenix saga, and then you have a couple episodes, issues that kind of slow it down. Then you have Days of Future Past, and you have Kitty Pryde getting chased around the mansion during Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever was going on at the time. And you had these quiet moments that are very fondly remembered, partly because you also had these big action moments. And the big action moments took on other meaning. I mean, one of the interesting parts about doing the Avengers issues is if you look through some of the comics that were published during the '90s, there were very few kind of quieter introspective, nuanced moments happening at all. And as a result, the action scenes became very two-dimensional, very forgettable. It's like, oh, here's, the that Avengers Unplugged. It was just terrible. I mean, in terms of, it's like, hey, here's some guys just kind of fighting in it, and many people actually look back on those issues now and are like, oh, this is a fun read, and they enjoy it. But it's largely because the balance has tipped too far in the other direction. A lot of comic writers who kind of grew up on some of the quieter moments or some of the more introspective comics have forgotten that you have to do both. You have to do the action and the quiet moments, or the quiet moments don't really matter. Or you do too much of it and you just get this kind of very boring title. And that's why you see people picking up comics from the 90s and be like, oh man, this is great. But if you suddenly shifted the balance the other direction, you read nothing but those kind of 90s all action comics, you would get sick of them in a hurry. And I could say this with confidence, somebody who ran a comic shop in the 90s, people got sick of that stuff fast. The first Extreme Comics Youngblood title came out. It's like, oh, this is new and interesting. And by the time you got along to Brigade and Prophet, and I mean, you kind of went down the line, and sooner than fairly quickly, it's like, okay, this is the charm is worn off, and that's what happened really, really fast for these books, and that's why you need a balance. I think this Craven's Last Hunt is a fascinating story because if you pick up and you read it, there's certainly some low grade horror going on there. There's certainly some action, but that is a psychological story. That's kind of the whole basis and meaning behind it. It's very much a psychological tale. And if you had nothing but that comic running around, if you were doing nothing but psychology and those kinds of comics over and over and over, I think people would probably get sick of it super fast. It would lose all of its momentum. Part of the reason that worked is because you knew Spider-Man, you knew what his heroism meant to him, you knew some of these more, if you were, shallow battles with Kraven. So when Kraven suddenly steps it up a notch and buries him and nearly makes good on his promise to kill him and hunt him, then it starts to that comic takes on new weight. Whereas if you just shot straight through with like, oh, here's a psychological it wouldn't mean anything. The history would have defeated the purpose. And so I think that a lot of people, a lot of comic creators struggle because they try and shoot right toward the kind of the payoff, and they forget the fact that they've got to build this thing up. They've got to make it really, really count and really matter. And if they don't do that, then they don't have as much of a comic. And vice versa. If you leave off all the quieter moments, then suddenly just the nonstop action just gets to be kind of repetitive. Very few people can tell you what went on from 96 or 95 to about 98, 99. Those years with the Avengers and with even the X-Men title, all that stuff, it gets to be quite a blur. I mean, they had Wolverine devolves into a kind of a feral creature, and you got the Wasp becomes a wasp, an actual not a slur, but an actual like insect woman. I mean, like the stuff was just all over the place, and it didn't have any meaning. And that's kind of that's just the interesting dynamic that comics had back then. And so I think you got to have both. Anyway, that's my premise. What do you think? You think this idea has any merit? I'm crazy. You would love to have just the talking moments. You'd like to have no talking moments. What do you want? Is talking moments the term that we really want to use here? What do you think? Leave me a comment below. Like, subscribe. Let me know your thoughts on all this, what you think, and what comics you enjoy. And like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter or Facebook at Comic Perch. Most importantly, thanks for listening.